Thank you, David, very much for the nice introduction, and thanks to the Phi Beta Kappa chapter here in Lexington for inviting me down to Washington and Lee, my first visit to your campus, beautiful campus. I come from another Washington university. I think we have several in the United States, so I'm somewhat of a sibling institution. And I'm also a Virginian. I live in the other end of the state in Arlington, just outside of the district. So beautiful to get down in this part of the state, and a nice day to do so as well. So thank you very much for the invitation. Very glad to be here and to speak to you tonight about rising China. That is the topic of the day, it seems like, or the topic of the century or the year. Many people approach it in different ways. Indeed, I think it's fair to say China is the world's most important rising power. There are others, but for at least for the last couple decades, and probably for the next one or two, that's I think a fair guess. Although India and Brazil, indeed, are making their move as well. But everywhere we look and turn and read, China seems to be in front of us, gobbling up natural resources around the world, certainly being a very quickly modernizing economy. The World Bank is correct. If they're going to continue, they have to make a number of adjustments, but I would suspect, like much other advice offered from outside, the Chinese government will consider it and then accept part of it. We'll see in that. But China certainly has been the engine of global growth, certainly in the aftermath of the global financial crisis recently, and really for the last 2 decades. It's been the largest recipient of foreign direct investment for these last 2 decades. It's now increasingly an exporter of investment abroad, ranking 3rd now in the world in terms of outbound direct investment, so-called ODI, if you include what they export to Hong Kong and Macau. So in the economic domain, China is clearly not just a rising power, it's risen. If you look at other areas such as the security domain, China is increasingly important, certainly in Asian security. It's in the last couple of years has sort of been flexing its muscles a little bit in the Asian neighborhood, causing some angst, I would say, for some of its neighbors. But it's also been contributing positively to international security through actions such as contributions to the UN peacekeeping operations in various countries. They have deployed at the moment more personnel than any other member of the Security Council of the United Nations, I think around 2,000 or so in about a dozen countries at the moment. So that's a very positive contribution. They've been making similar positive contributions to disaster relief operations in various parts of the world, as far away as Chile last year or 2 years ago after their earthquake. So in the security realm, we see both some positive and negative indicators. China's own military modernization has been proceeding apace for 2 decades, and now has the world's 2nd largest military budget after the United States, some ways after the United States, but nonetheless, in about 2 weeks' time, they will announce next year's budget at the annual meeting of the National People's Congress, and this year it's going to top $100 billion US. How far above 100 billion is another question, and how much they invest in their defenses that are not part of the official budget, that's yet another question. Nonetheless, the point is the Chinese military is now certainly the 2nd leading military power in East Asia after the United States, and in many areas globally. Diplomatically, we see China active in various parts of the globe and on the Security Council in the United Nations. I should immediately say, not always so positively. The recent veto, along with Russia, of the resolution last week, or 10 days ago or so, on Syria is an indication of China's and Moscow's views. about the Syrian crisis, but also about the norms of international relations. They are at considerable variance, to put it mildly, with the United States and other members of the international community, including the Arab League. I would like to associate myself with Secretary of State Clinton's condemnation of China for that veto. I think she was very outspoken, and correctly so. But that's sort of on the negative side. We see in diplomacy China just yesterday acting positively in bringing the United States and North Korea back to the table in Beijing and have forged an agreement whereby North Korea has once again promised to cease its ballistic missile tests, cease its uranium enrichment, and open its nuclear facilities at Yongbyon to international inspectors. That's good news. It's not the first time North Korea has promised to do that. But if it weren't for the Chinese, that agreement probably would not have come to pass. So that's a kind of positive. And we see China diplomatically active literally across the world today in ways and places that they have never been active before. In Latin America, in Central Asia, in Africa, the Middle East, Europe, and elsewhere. So diplomatically, China is now a risen power too, not necessarily still rising. Normatively, I'll talk about that tonight in more length. China is trying to expand its soft power and sort of broaden its global cultural footprint, shall we say. So in various dimensions that you can measure kind of empirically, China is having a greater impact on world affairs than ever before. So the question is really, looking forward now that China has risen to this position of number 2, if you will, behind the United States, how will it behave in the future, and what impact is that going to have for the United States, but indeed for the world? That is the grand strategic question of our era. What is China going to do with its wealth and power and increased influence? If I had an easy answer to that question, I probably wouldn't be a professor. But I don't have an answer to that question, which is why I am a professor. I'm still researching that. It's one of the great puzzles, and I've been studying China for over 3 decades, and it just gets more and more interesting as China's influence has risen. When I started studying China as an undergraduate at George Washington back in the mid-1970s, I had little idea, most people had little idea of what China was going to become. So you never know. At any rate, you can study China's impact on world affairs in these different domains, economic, strategic, security, diplomatic, energy, not unimportant. Young man in the front here is writing a paper on that. Just heard a very good presentation at GW yesterday on that subject. So, one can study these kind of empirically. But I'm going to suggest to you tonight that the impact that China has on the world in the future is going to be determined in no small part by its own intentions. All countries, how they behave internationally, have much to do with how they perceive themselves and how they perceive, indeed, the international environment and the nexus between their self-perception, their self-identity, and the international environment. So how countries allocate resources out there in the global environment, I would suggest, have a lot to do with their own domestic identities and perceptions. And ever since I was a student, actually, I've had an interest in the role of perceptions. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on Chinese perceptions of America, actually. So I think that it's very important for us to try and get inside of the Chinese mindset and discourse domestically inside of China to try and understand how Chinese see themselves and see their country's role, or roles, plural, in the international community. So that's what I'm going to talk about tonight, China's international identities, plural. I find that China has multiple identities and is having something of an identity crisis as a result of having many competitive ideas about its global role. That's why the talk tonight is subtitled The Conflicted Rising Power. So this is one sort of prism into, or one way to look at the whole question of China's rising power and what kind of actor is it going to be on the world stage. Okay, just as sort of background. Well, we see China behaving on the world stage in sometimes seemingly contradictory ways. Just think of the examples I just gave you. You know, Syria on the one hand, giving aid to Africa on the other. Disaster relief on the one hand, building up its nuclear ballistic missiles on the other. I mean, China's a very convoluted, contradictory country, and for every assertion, I can guarantee you can make it about China, you can make just the opposite assertion and both will be true. So this is not an easy country to understand. But what I'm suggesting is part of the reasons that we see some seemingly contradictory behavior on the world stage has to do with the fact that China is internally conflicted. Okay, so that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. And let me start by turning the question around a little bit, just at the beginning, to look at how the world sees China, rather than what I'm going to talk about for most of the evening, how China sees the world, or sees its own role in the world. So let's start, how does the world see China? And I've got a few slides that may not be visible to you. This is from the Pew Research Center. They do a constant series of what they call global attitude surveys of 24, 25 countries around the world on various questions. And this came out just at the end of last year, 2011. And the gist of it is every country in the world assumes that China is going to replace the United States as the leading superpower, including Americans. If you look at the last, let's see, there's a pointer here, I think. Anyway, the far third column at the top, just by a small, oh, I see how it works. Okay, right here, by a small margin. If you come down here, the Chinese, they definitely, if I can find it, they definitely think they're going to be on top of the heap. So, but everybody else does too. So there seems to be this kind of foregone conclusion that China's coming up, and oddly enough, the United States is on its relative way down, and the question is really when the two will pass economically. Now, what this question asks is superpower. What does that mean? These polls are not exactly scientific, but I just want to show it to you to give you a sense of this kind of common perception across the globe. This is another way to look at it across the globe. This is done by a different polling organization, the BBC, and something called GlobeScan. They poll 25 countries regularly on their perceptions of each other and on various international questions. So what you have here is the main point is that China's in the center. And the point is that the world has mixed, but generally more positive than negative perceptions of China's rise in 2010-11. Actually, if you looked at that over time, so China's in the middle, right? And then you can see the countries that are lower and higher. But the point is that there's kind of global ambivalence about China's rise and its influence. So the first slide shows that there may be a notion of inevitability of China's becoming the global superpower. Second slide shows you that there's sort of angst or uncertainty amongst many countries about that. Then if you look at this slide, this is more time series data from 2005 to 10. This is China, the brown line in the center. This is also from the BBC, GlobeScan polls. So the key point here is that over the 5 years from 2005 to 10, China's global reputation or influence, or what they call favorability ratings. You know, and as I say, these are not very scientific. Do you have warm and fuzzy feelings about China or negative feelings about China? So you get to vote warm and fuzzy or not so warm and fuzzy. But the point here is that China's international reputation declined rather steadily and significantly over that 5-year period, from 50% down to 34%, with a small spike in the wake of the Olympic Games in 2008. So over time, over the last 5 years, we see China's international image declining. Not good. It's 34%. You know, which is of concern to the Chinese government, because the Chinese government has now discovered the importance of image and reputation as part of what they call 综合国力, comprehensive power. Previously, they've been talking about comprehensive power for 3 or 4 decades, but it just had to do essentially with hard power, economic power, military power in particular. But now they've come to realize that soft power and image and public diplomacy play a role, and they are, I'm going to talk about this at greater length tonight, putting a lot of attention and resources into trying to improve China's global international image, precisely because it's not very good. Okay? In fact, it's poor, it's mixed at best, mixed to poor, and declining over time. And that really bothers the Chinese government, and I would say the Chinese people. They can't figure out why they are not loved abroad, and why, when their government comes out with statement after statement about their benign intentions, they aren't just believed on the face value of it. We believe in peaceful development. We will never seek hegemony. We're never going to challenge anybody. We're never going to be an aggressor, you know, so on and so forth. So there's a kind of cognitive dissonance in China amongst intellectuals, amongst the public, and certainly in the government about why their global image is poor. And they essentially think it's poor because of a systematic anti-China propaganda campaign run by the Western media monopolies. I'm serious, they believe, in fact, just read an article on it this morning, that the international media is under a kind of stranglehold of the big European and American and other newspapers, television, radio, and so on. So they feel that the negative images is the result of systematic bias, which is the result of, they think, propaganda manufactured by Western media. At any rate, they are troubled by their global image and now feel that they need to do something about it. And so what one sees in the wake of 2007, just in the last 4 years, is, as I say, first of all, a prioritization on increasing their image and broadening their normative soft power, cultural power abroad. The whole government, in fact, or the Communist Party, I should say, specifically had a meeting, Central Committee plenary session, which is about as high as they can go in China, short of a party congress, last October, and it was devoted to the subject of culture and domestic culture, improving China's domestic culture, and exporting China's culture abroad. So this is a high priority. So this, of course, is Times Square in Manhattan, photograph taken about a year ago, a little over a year ago, when President Hu Jintao came to the United States on a state visit, and the State Council Information Office took out 24/7 advertising time on these electronic boards in Times Square. There are many other examples that they've undertaken, including very recently, about 3 weeks ago, opening a television station, 24/7 CCTV, China Central Television Station, in Washington, D.C., up on New York Avenue and 11th Street, which is now broadcasting, as I say, 24 hours, 7 days a week, throughout the Americas. And then they have another one they've just opened in Nairobi, Kenya, which is broadcasting 24/7 throughout the Middle East and Africa. So they have in mind kind of becoming an Al Jazeera. And trying to break the monopoly of the BBC and the other American networks. So they're putting in newspapers, they're putting a lot of effort into resourcing their news media on a global basis to try and give a kind of good impression of Chinese history, Chinese civilization, Chinese culture, Chinese people, and so on. This is another element of China's soft power, the weaknesses of its soft power. The empty chair in Oslo at last year's Nobel Peace Prize awards ceremony, in which the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to Liu Xiaobo, who is presently serving an 11-year prison sentence in solitary confinement in a prison in Liaoning province for subversion of state power. What did Mr. Liu do to subvert state power? Well, he's written some very sharp critical essays for many years of the Chinese government, and was a organizer of the Charter 08 campaign. So he's clearly gotten under the Chinese government's skin, and this is what they do with people that get under their skin: solitary confinement. Well, the world community, or at least the Nobel Prize Committee, recognized him personally. And actually, I've just been reading there's a new book out of his writings that have been translated into English and published by Harvard University Press, I think, just a few months ago. Well worth reading. I commend them to you. This is no run-of-the-mill dissident. Man has some very powerful thoughts. But the Chinese government knows that too, and this is the way they deal with him. So the reason I show you these two slides, on the one hand, they're trying to improve their image in various media ways, what I call resourcing the messenger, or messengers. But this is, unless you have a good message, you can throw all the money you want at the messengers, and your messages will not resonate very well. And as long as China has people like Liu Xiaobo in prison and its human rights record, its image, at least in the West, is going to be badly tarnished. Not everywhere in the world, but certainly in the West. There's another element of China's international image. You may have seen this on YouTube or read about it in the newspapers last summer, when the Georgetown Hoyas went to play a series of friendly matches in China, including one against the national army team, the Bai Dui. Well, it broke out. First of all, the match was fixed. The referees called something like 60 fouls on the Americans and less than 10 on the Chinese team. And if you know anything about Chinese professional basketball, you'll know that there's a high degree of corruption in the officiating in Chinese professional basketball. In fact, let me plug another new book just out called Brave Dragons, written by Jim Yardley of the New York Times, and he's going to, tomorrow evening, in fact, give a talk in Washington at Politics and Prose bookstore about this new book, Brave Dragons, which is a Chinese professional team that he followed for a year. And it's a fascinating book. I read in manuscript form because I still play basketball, but I used to play in the university team in China. At any rate, one thing you learn from his book, and if you've lived in China and go to these games, you'll know a lot of them are, shall we say, what they call the Hei Shao, the black whistle. They're fixed. Well, this game was fixed, and when the Americans began to protest against a certain foul being called, immediately technical fouls, and finally it broke out into a one-way fight. And this photograph is, I think, quite indicative of that. And if you look at the full video on YouTube, it's even worse. Why do I show this to you? Chinese nationalism is a big element in China, in Chinese society, and is a big element in shaping China's future, past, current, and more importantly, future role in the world. Chinese nationalism is a very complicated phenomenon, but one part of it is a very angry, aggrieved nationalism, one that has been developed over many decades, and because of China's historical experience of with imperialism and colonialism and invasion by Japan and other things, what they call the century of shame and humiliation. But there is a very strong, I would argue, and negative element of anger and aggrievement in Chinese nationalism. It's not just pride and patriotism. It's a kind of nasty nationalism. It's not the only part of Chinese nationalism, but it is an element. And we see this in Chinese diplomacy. We see this in Chinese writings. We see this on the Chinese basketball court and in other places. Okay, so what's all this have to do with Chinese perceptions? Well, China has, as I say, since 2007, really begun to focus on soft power and trying to improve its global image. And these two bar graphs are just indications of articles published in Chinese academic journals and Chinese newspapers about the subject of soft power. Why was there such a spike in 2008? You see these big bars. Well, two reasons. One has to do with the translation of Joseph Nye's book on soft power into Chinese in 2006. So that's, in fact, when you start to see the rise in 2007. But the real spike comes in 2008 after Chinese President Hu Jintao gives a speech to the 17th Party Congress in which he references the importance of soft power and the need to improve China's global image. So this is one indicator about how Chinese intellectuals have become interested in writing about that. So I'll come back to that. So that's just sort of one way to start off, how the world sees China. Answer in a kind of conflicted way and for conflicted reasons. China's behaving in some positive ways in the world stage and some not so positive ways in the world stage. All right, so in the second part of the talk, let me briefly try and walk you through some of the topics, some of the debates that are animating this domestic discourse inside China about its global identities. And I should say, just to start, that there's probably no country in the world that is as self-conscious about its role as a rising power as are the Chinese, or as a power. There has been now for many years, a decade of intense discussion about this domestically. You can walk into Chinese bookstores, and right on the table as you go through the door, there's, sort of hot selling books. A number of them have to do with how to be a great power. Some how to become, it's like going into a, Barnes and Noble. I was going to say Borders. We don't have Borders anymore in this country, but by a Martha Stewart book on how to make a good quiche. In China, it's how to become a major power. So there's kind of interest in the intellectual community, lots of books about this subject. There's certainly interest on the internet and amongst netizens and the population at large. One indication of that was the popularity of a, I think, 11-part television series called Daguo Jueqi, Rising Powers, which aired in 2007 first, and then several times subsequently because of popular demand. Hundreds of millions of people watched this series. It was highly actually controversial and of great interest, and it studied the history of other rising powers historically and tried to learn lessons from not just their rises, more importantly, their declines. Why did these empires of the past fail and decline? So China's interested not only in problems that may lie ahead as they're on their way up, they're just as interested in what countries do when they're on their way down. And more importantly, they're interested in the intersection of those two, with what we call in political science the asymmetry trap, where the rising power confronts the established power, the United States. And political scientists are full of theories about the dangers involved of that transition point. It's called the power transition. And more often than not, power transitions have resulted in horrific war. So this TV series was very popular. What other? Oh, the Politburo, Chinese leaders themselves, do a very good thing, actually. They have class. They go to class once or twice a month for an afternoon. This is something that the current president, Hu Jintao, has introduced, and as I say, they go about twice a month, and each time there's a different topic that will be discussed, and professors are brought in to lecture to the Politburo. It's kind of an unnerving thing for a professor to do, I can imagine. I know a couple of these professors, and they prepared for months, you know, and they didn't want to get anything wrong, because if you get something wrong in front of the Politburo, you may not have a job the next day. But at any rate, there was a series of these Politburo study sessions on being a rising power. So all the way from the top to the bottom of the society, I would say there's this sort of obsession almost with being a rising power. It's a good thing, though. It's a self-awareness. They're studying the historical lessons of others, and they're trying to learn those lessons for China. So this is a animated discourse. So what are some of the issues that they're actually debating? These are 6 different ones. And for the sake of time, I'm going to have to just give you very brief sort of summaries of what they are, and then I'll talk about how the discourse can be disaggregated into different schools of thought. But first, you know, what are they talking about in their writings? And when I say they, here I have in mind intellectuals and sub-elites, not so much people on the internet or social media. So the first of these 6 debated issues has to do with a statement by the late Deng Xiaoping back in 1989 that China, and Deng made this statement just in the wake, first of all, of the June 4th incident, and secondly in the wake of the collapse of other Communist Party states across Eastern Europe. And the Chinese government, for those 2 reasons, was feeling rather insecure and embattled at that time. Those of you who remember it, or I was living there that year, this was not a very pleasant time to be in China. So Deng Xiaoping said, "Comrades, Fang Xin, take it easy. We must bide our time, hide our brightness, don't take the lead, budang tou, but we should do some things," which is meant to say that we should take some proactive steps in diplomacy where it meets our national interests. So this was Deng's advice 22 years ago. The Chinese are still debating this constantly, whether China should still keep a low profile, bide its time. High brightness means keep a low profile. Or should China take a higher profile? China is a different country now than it was 22 years ago, many Chinese argue. We should be out there being more proactive in the world community, not doing some things, but doing a lot of things. And we should be taking the lead. There is a whole cohort of Chinese intellectuals who think it's time to get rid of Deng's advice. We've outgrown it, they say. Our country is now a Changguo. We're strong. Let's show the world what we stand for and show our neighbors. So that's one of the ongoing debates. It's not resolved. The predominant view is, in fact, no, Deng's advice is still correct. We must still keep a low profile. But anyway, it's debated. The second issue, so-called peaceful rise, which grew out of the rising power lectures in the Politburo. And some Chinese party theoreticians by the name of Zheng Bijian came up with the notion that we must have a global campaign to convince the world that our rise is going to be different than all these other 11 empires that we studied. We're going to do it peacefully, and we're not going to have a world war. We're not going to create conflict. But after a couple of years, the debate dropped the term rise because it was thought to be too threatening to foreigners. And so now, if you read the Chinese discourse, it's termed peaceful development from the Chinese leaders on down. So that debate's pretty well been concluded. International structure. The Chinese Chinese international relations experts, I should say, I'm always sort of intrigued by their analyses of the global situation because they're almost like geometrists. They're constantly trying to measure the structure of power and poles in particular. What countries present poles in the world? How many poles are there? Unipolarity, bipolarity, tripolarity, quadrangles, pentagons, pivots, nodes. I mean, it's a very kind of realist approach to international relations. So the Chinese have had this debate as to what is the nature of the international structure. Is the United States still the sole superpower, or is it in fact in relative decline? And I should note here that Chinese analysts of international affairs have repeatedly, since the early 1980s, predicted the decline of the United States. And repeatedly, they, heretofore at least, have gotten it wrong. And I'm going to suggest that they're getting it wrong this time too. In the late 70s, mid 80s, and the early 2000s, there were big debates about America's decline. And America showed some resiliency in each of those cases. So they've kind of come up with this compromise position they call "yi chao duo chang." There's one superpower, but many other powers. The world is moving towards multipolarity, which has been their prediction now for 3 decades. But the United States is still the big guy on the block, and so somehow the international system reflects these two factors, and that there is what they call a 主要矛盾, a central contradiction between the big guy on the block and the growing multipolarity in the world. Fourth issue they debate, or series of issues here, have to do with what's become known as global governance in international affairs. Public goods that are common to all mankind and do not know sovereign borders. The environment, series of what we call transnational security issues like piracy or organized crime or terrorism, and so on. And for that matter, economic security and energy security. But these are all things that take place in the space between nations out there in the international environment that all nations are affected by. So the Chinese have been discussing the concept of responsible power. They've been discussing global governance as a result of this notion of what they call a 负责任的大国. 负责任的大国 was first put into their vocabulary by none other than Robert Zoellick, the current president, soon to retire, president of the World Bank. When Robert Zoellick, before he went to the World Bank, was Deputy Secretary of State under the last Bush administration, he gave a very important speech in 1995 in New York City in which he called on China to become a, quote, responsible international stakeholder and responsible power, by which he argued that China had been a major beneficiary over the previous 2 to 3 decades of the international system that had been built up in the wake of the Second World War, largely by Western powers, the Bretton Woods system. And that now, and China had benefited more than any other country from that system, and now, Zoellick argued in 2005, it was time for China to start contributing more to global governance as a responsible international stakeholder. It has a stake in the international system. It's time to stop just taking, free riding on the international system, and contributing more commensurate with China's level of economic and other forms of national power. That was what Zellick was arguing. Well, this, you can imagine, triggered a huge firestorm of a debate inside of China. You know, first of all, who is this American to say that we are not responsible? So it immediately touched the nationalist chord in the Chinese body politique that here we are again, the Americans telling us what to do and defining responsibility in their way. We Chinese have 1.3 billion people, and our greatest contribution to international global governance is to feed, house, and clothe 1.3 billion people at home. That's what we contribute. It's not, we don't have the time, the luxury, or the resources, and the money, or anything else to go out there into the international community and do some things, as Deng Xiaoping would say, particularly if those things have to do with crimes against humanity, such as was going on in that case in Africa and is now going on in Syria. So the responsible power debate, the majority of Chinese who entered this debate were very skeptical of it. There were a few scholars who said, no, 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 Zellick is right. We are a bigger, stronger power now. We're a member of the Security Council. We're a permanent member of the Security Council. We're the world's second largest economy, second largest military, large continental country, so on and so forth. We should be doing more than some things, but they're a minority voice. The majority voice, and there's real consensus in China, is that this whole concept of responsible power was, first of all, a condescending Western concept, and B, a trap. A trap laid by the United States, just the latest trap, to retard China's rise and rightful place in the world. The Chinese are of the view that the United States has been trying to restrain China's rise for a couple of decades, and this is just the latest tactic. In fact, I had a fairly high-ranking Chinese official tell me a couple summers ago, David, you know, you the United States, in the 1980s, if I can find the quotation, he said, yeah, first you, the United States, tried to subvert our political system in the 1980s. That led to Tiananmen. You failed. Then you tried to contain us in the 1990s. You failed. He was arguing, we broke out of it with our regional diplomacy, which I'll come back to in a minute. And then he said, now, in the 2000s, you are trying to bleed us through international entanglements, the notion of responsible power. You want to get us involved out there in Afghanistan and Iraq and a few of these other places where you are, and we don't have any national interest there. So the predominant view is that this whole concept of global governance, responsibility, multilateralism, that is to say working through international institutions, is a tactic and a trap, and China shouldn't be lured into that trap. So there's deep skepticism in China about this whole concept, and hence, as you might expect, puts China on one side of the global debate on this issue compared to other countries, at least Western countries. Okay, last two issues they debate, the harmonious world and soft power. Actually, there's not much of a debate about harmonious world. This is a term that came into the Chinese vocabulary and international propaganda over the last 4 years because it was put there by none other than the president, Hu Jintao, who gave a big speech in New York at the United Nations calling for a harmonious world, and he had 4 or 5 different characteristics of what a harmonious world would look like. It was sort of the twin to what he called the harmonious society that China is trying to build domestically. But so in China, if the president comes out with a phrase or a concept like this, you don't debate it. It's the president, you know, that's the party's view. Many Chinese, though, didn't feel it was an appropriate, ones I've talked to, didn't think it was an appropriate concept, so their way of debating it is not to reference it in their writings. And then finally, soft power. So I say they've become very interested in that concept, and they've been pouring a lot of resources into it. Okay, so those are some of the issues that have animated the discourse about China's global identity. Let me then turn to the third part of the talk and disaggregate this discourse for you. These are 7 different schools of thought of different, again, what I call semi-elites, intellectuals. But in the case of a couple of these schools, the Nativists and the Realists, I would argue, their views resonate and are voiced very much at the popular level, particularly amongst youth on the internet and some social media. Social media are not permitted in China. There is no Facebook in China. There is no Twitter in China. It's all banned, blocked. But they have what they call Weibo, which is a kind of Chinese version of Twitter, which is carefully monitored and censored too. Anyway, so this is the heart of the argument tonight, is that China has multiple, 7 at least, different identities that are simultaneously competing in the argument about what kind of international power we should be. So this is a spectrum on the question of what kind of power we should be, and what you might call tendencies or schools of thought. And while they are intellectually distinct, there is some overlap. When you talk to intellectuals and international relations experts or officials, there's some overlap between them. So it's not easy to just say such and such a person or such and such an institution is a globalist or a nativist. Unfortunately, it's not quite so simple. There are many people hold conflicting views simultaneously. But let me walk you through these 7 schools rather quickly to give you a sense of the arguments. So down here in the left-hand side of the spectrum is what I call the nativists. This is a group of a kind of ad hoc group of pundits. Many of them don't really even hold day jobs. They're kind of freelance writers, and they write very racy, nationalistic prose and sell and support themselves selling these books and articles, and write a lot on the internet. And their voices are not suppressed by the government. It's very interesting. The government allows this kind of these kinds of xenophobic views to be vented. And one argument can be that government's doing that intentionally because it's venting, right? And it allows the steam to be blown off. Another way to put it is that the government's trying intentionally to cultivate it. Whichever view is correct, I'm not sure, maybe both. The nativists are a collectivity of populist, often Marxist, hyper-nationalists. They are very distrustful of the outside world. They seek international autonomy for China. They view international relations and certainly multilateral involvement as traps, as I just laid by the West, as I just mentioned, that they should avoid. And they are vociferous critics of the West, the United States in particular. And they have a very Marxist kind of orientation. Those who do have day jobs work in research institutes under the Central Committee of the Communist Party. So these people are they're very discontent with Chinese government policy. They don't think that China ever should have opened the door to the outside world in the first place, because it's just brought in all kinds of negative, corrosive influences, economically, socially, intellectually, politically, you name it. They think that the last 30 years has been, I don't know if a complete failure, but indeed has opened China to contamination from abroad, particularly, again, the West. So this is a group of aggrieved, ultra-aggrieved individuals. Just inside of the nativists, and we have to realize, I mean, at each end of the spectrum in any country, the schools that are at the end of the spectrum tend not to be the majority. They are distinct minorities, and in China's case, the nativists are a minority, but I will argue that their arguments resonate with the broad populace, and particularly young people today. This angry China I just spoke about earlier, that's where they are, the nativists. So they're not completely peripheral. Then you have what are known as the realists, and as in realists in international relations in any country, this is a group of writers who are more pragmatic and less xenophobic than the nativists, but no less nationalistic, in fact, more nationalistic. These are what you might call China firsters. They want to do away with Deng Xiaoping's theory of modesty and biding time and not taking the lead. These are the people who say, no, 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 we're a big power now. We got to get out there and act like a big power. Let's teach those Americans a lesson. Stop them from selling weapons to Taiwan by calling in the debt that we hold. I'm serious, there are some people who argue that. Let's build our military. We need not one aircraft carrier, we need a half dozen aircraft carriers. We need long-range bombers. We need cyber. I mean, these people argue for what is known as offensive realism. They are interested in making China even stronger than it already is, but using the power. It's not good just to have your powder dry, in their view. It needs to be exercised. It's like Madeleine Albright once observed, what good is your military if you don't use it? Well, they believe that about their own military. But when you talk to and read the writings of these realists, first you get a sense of like realists everywhere, they view the outside world as very unpredictable, very anarchic, and very predatory. It's a dangerous place out there in the world. And the only way we, China, just like American realists, by the way, or realists anywhere else would argue, the only way we can navigate in this Hobbesian predatory world is to be strong ourselves, defend ourselves, deter others, deter aggression. Sound familiar? They see kind of an intrinsic competitiveness in world affairs, and particularly with the United States. They are not optimistic about U.S.-China relations. They see long-term competition and even conflict coming with the U.S. and argue, therefore, that China needs to get ready for that conflict. So these are not exactly optimistic people. They're rather pessimistic. But they're also very frustrated. As I say, they think that China should use its strength and use its power, and they are frustrated by the government's continued restraint in using it in Asia and on a global basis. And finally, there's a kind of triumphalism in the last 2 years amongst the realists in the wake of the global financial crisis. They think, finally, the Western capitalist system, as Lenin and we Chinese Marxists have long predicted, has had its comeuppance. And we Chinese, with the China model, the 中国模式, have been proven that our model, our path, is a valid one for economic development. So this is a group of, it's rather triumphalist, confident, but frustrated individuals. Then you have, thirdly, what I call the major powers school. Major powers school are, as the name would suggest, a group of analysts and officials. Fortunately, if you ask me where does the Chinese government fit on this spectrum, I would say largely in this school. These are pragmatic individuals. They argue that China has many interests in the world, but if we don't manage relations with the major powers correctly, everything else will be compromised. And one major power in particular, the US, they call zhong zhong zhi zhong, the key of the keys. Got to keep things at least on a stable level with Washington. if things are out of kilter with Washington and we have a competitive adversarial environment, it's going to impact everything else that we need: technology, investment, Taiwan, Asian regional security, and many other issues that the Americans have disproportionate influence over. So these people argue that you've got to maintain at least a modicum or a facade, if not the reality, of stable relations with the U.S. But there's another subgroup that says, no, it's not the U.S. with whom we have to maintain close ties. It's Moscow. We're really, we're not on the same page as the Americans, normatively, intellectually, in terms of world affairs, but we are with the Russians. Witness the Security Council veto last week. And so there's a smaller subgroup that says, no, we've got to build up our relations with the Russians and together stand up against the West. And I think we're starting to see some of this played out again just in the last few weeks in the wake of the Libya crisis and the Syria crisis. There was another subgroup, I used this in the past tense, that argued that no, it's not Moscow and not Washington that we should be prioritizing, it's Brussels, the European Union, and that we should really work very closely with the EU, but that group has sort of fallen off the wayside as the EU itself has fallen off, even after Lisbon and under the sovereign debt crisis. So China's Europe watchers are a little bit depressed people these days. Okay, I realize time is running, but let me, when should I conclude? Probably already.
How can I answer that question diplomatically? I leave it up to you, whatever you want to do.
Well, I don't want to keep people too late, and I want to leave.
Yeah, so.
It's all right. But I want to have time for Q&A.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me just very briefly try and walk you through the rest of this. The other four, I mean, they're all, schools are all evident by the titles I give them. The Asia Firsters argue it's not the major powers we need to emphasize. It's our neighborhood. If we don't have good relations with those countries around us, our national security is going to be threatened. That's going to hurt our domestic development. So we've got to really put our priorities on everybody around our periphery. Global South, this is an interesting group of people that I didn't appreciate how strong their voice was until the last couple of years. They argue that China should emphasize the developing world and other rising powers, and that China has always been a developing country, is still a developing country, and therefore should align with other major developing countries for what? For a redistribution of wealth and power from north to south. They think that the international system is a very inequitable system, and it needs to be turned on its head. Hence you see things like the BRIC grouping or the BASIC grouping, and China partnering together with other large developing countries. And then the last two groups are kind of siblings of one another, what I call the selective multilateralists and the globalists. The globalists are, to go back to the argument about global governance, these are the John Eikenberrys and Anne-Marie Slaughters of China. They argue that China needs to participate in global governance together with the EU and the United States. There was talk a couple of years ago about a G2. These are the advocates in China of the G2. But their voice has also diminished significantly. And the majority argue, no, China should be doing some things, as Deng Xiaoping said, but selectively and only in areas that really matter to its national interest, like North Korea. So we saw yesterday China brokering the agreement between the United States and North Korea. That's called selective multilateralism. Okay? Iran is a whole other case, which we can get into if you're interested. This slide is too hard for you to read, so we'll skip it. Let me just conclude then with the so what question. All right, I live up in the other part of the state, Washington, D.C., where we always ask, so what? What does it mean for policy? What does it mean for the United States? And there are two ways to answer this. One is to position these 7 schools on this matrix. Generally speaking, are they, in terms of Chinese diplomacy, active or passive? Are they anti-American, or can they work with the United States? And you see here the 3 groups, or 4 groups really, that can work with the United States. And then the 3 that can't. So let me come then to the very conclusion. What does it mean? And you can read for yourselves. I mean, first of all, the nativists are an important voice in China. We have to be aware of them. Should not ignore them. They don't hold office. It's like if you drive through this country and you listen to AM radio, which I was doing today. It's not the same discourse you hear inside the Beltway, which may or not be a good thing. So the nativists in China, we have to be aware of them, but they don't hold power. Okay, but those who do hold power have to respond to their views. Secondly, the realists, this group is out to challenge the U.S., I would argue, through a strengthening China. What should the United States do? In gold is what the U.S. should do. It's called strategic hedging. Not containment. You can't contain China, but we should hedge against China together with other countries that are equally concerned about the rise of China. Major powers school, this is the ace in the deck for Washington. This is the group we can work with. Unfortunately, as I say, these are the pragmatists who do hold power in China. The last week we had the Chinese Vice President Xi Jinping touring the country, trying to keep the U.S. relationship stable. That's what that's all about. That's a good thing. We can work with that. The Asia Firsters, it depends what they want with Asia. Do they want to create a solitary sphere of influence? Or do they want to work together with the U.S. and other Asian countries? A little unclear. If the latter, that's good news. If the former, then there's a competitive dynamic with the U.S. And that is what the Obama administration's so-called pivot to Asia of the last few months is all about. Global South, we have to realize China's placing those who argue for this, trying to compete for sort of world court of public opinion amongst middle powers and developing countries. So the U.S. has to get in the game. I would argue the U.S. hasn't been in the game with these countries in these regions. Finally, selective multilateralism and globalism. We have to welcome both. Let's work with China where we can, but be sober-minded about the restraints and the suspicions and the constraints that China has on their own global behavior. So what's the upshot of all this? China is a conflicted power. There's a robust discourse in China. There is no single Chinese identity about what it should be doing in the world. There are multiple identities, and that's the reason I think we're seeing this kind of schizophrenic behavior on the world stage that we've been witnessing from China in the last couple of years in particular. So this is a work in progress, China's discourse that is, and Chinese diplomacy. Over time, we will see how it ends up, but I will just finish by saying that the center of gravity, if you will, you may wonder, where is it? In the middle here? In the middle of the spectrum? The answer is no. It's down here in terms of discourse, with the nativists and the realists. That's not good news for China's neighbors. That's not good news for the United States, and it's not good news for China. To the extent that China can move the discourse along to the right-hand end of the spectrum, it's going to be a lot easier partner for other countries to deal with. So I'll stop there. Sorry for running over, but be delighted to have whatever questions you may have. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Does the party have all 7 viewpoints represented within the party, and how do they deal with a party line in terms of these 7 viewpoints?
That's an excellent question. I'd argue that the party has 74 million members now, and there are all 7 viewpoints are encapsulated somewhere amongst those 74 million members. I know individual party members who fall into each one of those categories. But if you mean by the party officials at fairly high levels, then The answer is no. There are no globalists, for example, in the party at governmental levels. There are very few even multilateralists there, and the way that what I just ended saying, the nativist realists with some elements of major power pragmatism and some elements of South-South fraternity, sort of developing world fraternity. That is very much represented in the party. So at the highest levels. So we see, that's what we see. We see in kind of angry, realist China, but one that understands it has to be pragmatic on occasion, you know, with the United States and others, and cultivate other developing countries so as to undermine the hegemony of the United States. That's what it's all about. They're out to undermine what they call the hegemony of the United States.
What would you say to someone like, every time I come home, my dad says this, he grew up, you know, post-World War II when Japan was the rising power and they owned the majority of our debt, and everyone was, he said, you know, oh, they were all saying the same thing about Japan, it's not going to be a big deal. And then someone like myself and who says, oh no, this is going to be a much more, though not nearly as hostile and aggressive an affair, it's going to be a much more long-term thing like we had with the Soviet Union, where there's an aspect of mutually assured destruction, whereas with the Soviets it was with, you know, nuclear missiles, whereas today it's with technology.
Well, your father or yourself, I think, is very perceptive. Actually, it does involve nuclear missiles, but not in the way that did in the Cold War. No, this relationship, as much as one can hope for and work for cooperation and commonality between our two countries, and one should hope for and work for that. I want to emphasize that. That is desirable. It's achievable to some extent, but I have to say, having been in this business for more than 3 decades, I'm increasingly skeptical about that. I see the increasingly competitive dynamics rising in this relationship, and so at the end of the day, though, it's really a question of not either cooperation or competition, but both. It's a question of how to manage competition and keep it from going, if I had a spectrum towards conflict, you know, manage competition, which is a whole different situation than with the Soviet Union. We were managing an adversarial relationship then. We are not adversaries with the Chinese yet. There are people in this country, though, that think that we are, and there are certainly people, as I just finished discussing, in China who think that we are, but we're not there yet. So the question is how to expand the cooperative sphere between our two societies. And I would distinguish here between society and government. You know, how many of you come from China? Your hands up, please. No, you two guys right here. You sure Dalu Laidama? Singapore. Oh, okay, excuse me. Apologies. Anybody from China? Okay, great. Well, you are 2 of 158,000 Chinese students on American university campuses at the moment. That's great news. We have, you know, as you say, economic interdependencies, cultural interdependencies and exchanges. All kinds of things are going on between our societies that were never going on between the United States and the Soviet Union. That's why the whole notion of containment is a fallacy. Chinese who argue that the United States is trying to contain China, excuse me? If this is the way we go about containing a country, then I'd like to see what openness is really about. So the societal, my point is that the societal interactions is a really good buffer against the competitive dynamics that exist at the governmental level, particularly and increasingly in the national security domain, but also in the economic domain, and I would argue in the diplomatic normative domain. What we see over Syria is a microcosm of what I would argue is now an ideological struggle between the United States and China for world order and the kind of international order that we all live in, you know. Can we sit by while something like that is going on in Syria? Well, the Chinese say yes, we can. The world can, and the world should. The Americans and everybody, even the Arab League and the European Union and everybody else says, no, we can't. We did that in Rwanda, look what happened. We did that in Sudan, look what happened. So I would argue that there is an increasingly ideological element in this relationship which adds to the competitive nature. So long story short, mixture of competition and cooperation, and that's going to be the case for the indefinite future unless some accident happens that turns it into an adversarial relationship, which we cannot rule out. We have accidents in this relationship, and we hope that there are not more, but we don't have the kinds of, what do you call them, sort of communications channels that we had with the Soviet Union in case of an accident. The Chinese refuse to have those kinds of communication channels with the US government. We have tried repeatedly to establish hotlines and other mechanisms in case of a ship or a plane or you know, a missile or some other incident taking place. So, you know, I think that there's a kind of fragility to the relationship today, and the general direction is actually towards the competitive end of the spectrum, not, unfortunately, towards the cooperative end. But there's going to be this tug and pull back and forth between the two, so I think you've asked a good question. We're going to have to live with both elements. Now, that's not easy for Americans. Americans are kind of black and white people. Right? We like are good guys, bad guys, black hats, white hats. Are the Chinese our friends or are they our enemies? Well, Stephen Colbert tells us that there are frenemies. Right? So this is a hard thing for Americans conceptually to manage, I would argue. Yeah, let's start.
I'm wondering about the link between the party's legitimacy and the party's sort of line, or China's line internationally. So one thing are the 7 different types of discourses, but there are some very real population groups within those. The nativists are, well, the netizens or the young angry youth. Realists, you've got the PLA, you've got the business community further to the right, that the party has to sort of cater to. We've seen some of the accidents that you mentioned, like the Belgrade bombing and the spy plane over Hainan and so on. The Communist parties had some trouble with controlling the sort of outbursts of different kinds of feelings. I mean, it's intervening with the Communist Party's ability to rule. So how much domestic pressure, how much does domestic pressure affect China's foreign policy lying toward the U.S.?
Good and big question. But I would say that the party's legitimacy is largely tied to that kind of angry nationalism. That those outbursts of angry nationalism are not an accident. First of all, they exist in society. They don't have to be stirred up by the government, but the government benefits from it. The party particularly benefits from it. Nationalism is a key source of the Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy. And therefore, these nativists and realists and those elements in China, that's not good news for the relationship with the United States. And as I say, there's potential for accidents to happen. Bombings, planes, ships, other things, in which Chinese nationalism becomes inflamed and contributes to deterioration of the relationship. That could easily lead it to spiral a bit out of control of their own government. Right? And if you talk to many Chinese government officials, they will quickly tell you, oh, we are just having, you know, we are under tremendous pressure from our society. And I think they're telling the 100% truth. They are. So the pragmatists in the major powers school who would like to kind of manage things, like all good officials do, are being pressured from society and from the intelligentsia and from within the party and from the military. You're quite right, in the public security and state security organs. So the kind of, they have a hard time. You know, those who are in favor of managing, you know, good cooperative ties with the U.S. are having a very hard time domestically in China. So I wish I could be more optimistic about this. I'm concerned, though. Gentleman in the back.
In terms of East-West relations and the your presentation on Trump, how do you see Brazil fitting in the picture as a country in the Western Hemisphere that is rising power, that has all recently been trying to exert its independence from the traditional U.S. sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere? Do you have an opinion on how Brazil could be either a stumbling block or kind of a mediator between the U.S. and China? How do they fit into the picture?
Well, I'm a China watcher, not a Brazil watcher, so I don't know that much about Brazil, but as part of my research, I've been visiting Brazil 3 times in the last 3 years to try and understand the nature of the China-Brazil relationship, in fact, as well as in China, having a number of meetings with the Brazilian embassy. Brazil, like many Latin countries, but perhaps more than others, has been trying to broaden, or as you say, reduce its dependence on North America and the U.S. That's not just Brazil, it's kind of across the continent. But as a result, there's been a kind of horizontal, how to put it, horizontal diplomacy, omnidirectional diplomacy by Brazil with the European Union and with other Asian countries, of which China is one. So there's been a diversification in Brazilian foreign policy in the last decade plus, and you'll find the same thing in Chilean, Argentine, Peruvian foreign policy as well, and then there's Venezuela. The first point I'd make is that whatever the Brazilians are doing with China is not isolated. It's part of this broader diversification to reduce dependency on North American markets and an American sphere of influence, if there is such a thing anymore. Secondly, though, Brazil quickly signed up to this concept of the BRICS that the Chinese have been instrumental in pushing. And when Lula was in office, the prior president of Brazil, there was a real symmetry of thinking between the Chinese and the Brazilians over these issues I just talked about in the lecture, about redistribution, about forming coalitions and blocs in various multilateral organizations against the United States and the EU, try and act more coherently within the G77. Okay? But now, under the new president, one sees less of that. And one sees, in fact, frictions between China and Brazil over a variety of trade issues, technology issues, and even military transfer issues. So my sense of it now is that the bilateral relationship between China and Brazil is a bit strained, and it's not as simpatico as it had been just a few years ago. Good question, though. Yes.
Do you see, first off, I was wondering if you have a prediction as to how China might change or not change their policy on Syria in the coming weeks and months, assuming that violence continues? And then as well, do you see any repercussions of China's kind of hands-off policy towards Syria, particularly with regard to China's Uyghur population and the ongoing struggle that they've had?
Goodness. Well, I don't have a crystal ball, to forecast the future. China has done itself a lot of damage. And if it's trying to build its soft power in the world, this is not the way to go about it. It's particularly in the Middle East, not just in the West, in the Middle East. They're running completely opposite the Arab League in all of this as well. And indeed Brazil and other developing countries. So I don't know what's behind them in this diplomacy. This is a time when they could have abstained rather than issuing a joint veto, to show at least some neutrality, but they're not showing neutrality, or they haven't been. What one is going to want to look for, and there have been a couple of speculative articles in newspapers in the last few days that the Chinese will try and walk it back a little bit and separate themselves a little bit from Moscow. Now, Moscow has real interests in Syria, economic and military and sphere of influence for many, many decades. The Chinese, oddly enough, do not. compared to Libya. Now in Libya, they had, as you know, 36,000 workers that they evacuated. They had something like $38 billion worth of investments. They had over 300 companies operating in Libya. They had a big footprint in Libya. They have a very tiny one in Syria. I read in the Financial Times this last week, they have sort of like $1.2 billion of total investment. They have maybe 30 companies and a couple thousand people work in the oil sector. So they don't have a lot, and they don't sell weapons to Syria. So then you have to ask, why are they so, siding up with the Russians on this? And, in a case of clear case of, we know of, civil war and of atrocities against humanity and a regime that's going to go down. It's a question of how and when rather than whether, and how many lives are lost in the process. I would imagine there's an inevitability of that. So why are the Chinese doing this? I don't have a good answer for that. I can't imagine this just on principle. They feel that they were burned on Libya because they voted for the resolution in favor of protecting the civilians, right? That was an open door to NATO to go in and assist the insurgents against the Gaddafi regime. So they and the Russians feel very badly burned by their Libya vote. So maybe this is just kind of a protest vote, but we'll have to see, if how they behave. But they got to dig themselves out of a hole. They have really, this is not exactly what you call intelligent diplomacy, in my view. So I don't really have a good answer for you, but it's, will Chinese pragmatism somehow come back? It's very hard, though, to back off from what they've already now done.
I think maybe we can take one more, and then we'll have to cut it off.
Okay, right here.
Yeah. Besides the annoying veto power, is there any actual problem with China not being willing to intervene militarily in other countries? I feel like from the American perspective, that's probably the best option in terms of national security.
I'm not sure I follow the question. What is China's opposition to intervention?
Is there any real problem for the United States that they're not willing to intervene in other countries?
Well, if they prevent other countries from intervening in humanitarian situations such as this, I would say there is a problem. Yes. It's not that we need them to go in, side by side with the 82nd Airborne. I wouldn't expect that. It would be nice if they, would come to that, at least under UN auspices. But, at least not to prevent, when there's such a majority view, a consensus in the UN Security Council and the UN General Assembly. My goodness, they were one of 13 countries out of 179 that voted against it in the General Assembly this week. So to be in opposition is to be part of the problem rather than part of the solution. So to go back to your question, the question is how can they move into a kind of more neutral stance, at least not to oppose humanitarian intervention, and even under UN auspices. Now, if they were to back off and the UN would authorize a UN mission, that would put them in a really tough position.
Well, thank you very much for turning out.
Thank you.